Margaret had been cleaning the Riverside Martial Arts Academy for nearly 15 years, and in all that time she had never caused a stir or drawn attention to herself. She arrived each evening at 7:30, just as the last classes were wrapping up and the students were heading home with their gear bags slung over their shoulders. Margaret was 62, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and kind eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of someone who had raised 4 children and weathered life's storms with quiet grace. She wore comfortable shoes and moved through the gym with practiced efficiency, wiping down mirrors, mopping floors, and cleaning the locker rooms while humming old songs from her youth. The students barely noticed her, and she preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that invisible work was often the most important work, and she took pride in leaving the academy spotless for the next day's training. On this particular Thursday evening, the advanced class was running late. Margaret waited patiently in the small office, reviewing her cleaning supplies and watching through the window as the students practiced their forms. Among them was David Martinez, a 28-year-old second-degree black belt who had been training at the academy for over a decade. David was talented. There was no denying that, and he had won several regional competitions in his division. But success had made him cocky, and he had developed a habit of showing off, especially when newer students were around. Margaret had observed this behavior many times over the years, and it reminded her of her youngest son, Tommy, who had gone through a similar phase in his 20s before life taught him some humility. As the class finally ended and students began filing out, David noticed Margaret preparing her cleaning cart. Something about her quiet presence seemed to amuse him, and he decided to entertain the few remaining students with what he thought would be a harmless joke. "Hey, everyone," David called out with a grin. "Before you go, why don't you watch this?" He walked over to Margaret, who was organizing her supplies, and cleared his throat dramatically. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in an exaggerated formal tone. "I was wondering if you might be interested in a little sparring match." The remaining students chuckled, and Margaret looked up with genuine confusion. "I beg your pardon, young man," she said in her gentle voice. "Well, you've been watching us train for years." David continued playing to his audience. "Surely you must have picked up some moves by now." Margaret set down her spray bottle and looked at David with the same patient expression she had used countless times with her own children when they were being foolish. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said quietly. But David was enjoying the attention and pressed on. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, "just a little demonstration for everyone." Margaret glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered and saw the mix of amusement and anticipation on their faces. She recognized this moment from her own life, when she had been underestimated before, when people had made assumptions about what a quiet older woman might or might not be capable of. For a brief moment she thought about declining again and simply going about her work. But then she remembered her father's words from decades ago when she was a young woman facing her own challenges. Sometimes, Margaret, he had told her, the kindest thing you can do is teach someone a lesson they need to learn. Margaret straightened up and looked David in the eye. "All right," she said simply, "if you insist." The small crowd grew quiet, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. David grinned and bowed formally, then took up a fighting stance that he was sure would impress everyone. Margaret stood calmly for a moment, then moved into a stance that made several of the more experienced students gasp. It was perfect textbook form that spoke of years of serious training. Before David could fully process what he was seeing, Margaret stepped forward with fluid grace. Her movements were economical, precise, and completely without wasted motion. In less than 3 seconds, David found himself flat on his back, staring up at the gymnasium ceiling, while Margaret stood over him with her hands clasped calmly behind her back. The silence in the gym was absolute. David lay there trying to figure out exactly what had happened while Margaret walked back to her cleaning cart as if nothing unusual had occurred. "How?" was all David managed to say as he slowly got to his feet. Margaret continued organizing her supplies, but spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I started training when I was 12 years old," she said matter-of-factly. "My father was a Korean War veteran who learned Taekwondo during his service." She picked up her mop and began preparing it for use. "He taught me that martial arts weren't about showing off or proving how tough you were," she continued. They were about discipline, respect, and protecting the people you care about. David dusted himself off, his face red with embarrassment. When I was younger, Margaret went on, I competed in tournaments and did quite well. She paused and looked up at the group of students who were hanging on her every word. But then I got married and had children, and life became about different priorities. Margaret began mopping the mats with the same methodical care she brought to everything. I kept training though, she said. Not in gyms or schools, but in my backyard early in the morning before my family woke up. I never stopped because the discipline and focus helped me through some very difficult times. David stood watching her work, feeling smaller with each passing moment. Mrs. He began, then realized he didn't even know her name. Margaret. She supplied without looking up. Margaret Chen. Mrs. Chen. David said, I want to apologize. Margaret continued mopping, but nodded for him to continue. That was wrong of me. David said, I was being disrespectful and I'm sorry. Margaret finally stopped and looked at him directly. Apology accepted. She said, but there's something more important you should understand. She leaned on her mop handle and her voice took on the tone of someone who had learned hard lessons. When you challenge someone as a joke, you're not just risking embarrassment. She said, you're showing everyone around you what kind of person you really are. David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Those students who were watching, Margaret continued, they weren't just seeing whether you could beat up a cleaning lady. They were seeing whether you treat people with dignity regardless of their job or their age or their appearance. Margaret resumed her work, but kept talking. Leadership in martial arts isn't about being the strongest or the fastest, she said. It's about setting an example of character and respect. The best instructors and senior students I've known over the years weren't the ones who could beat everyone else. They were the ones who made everyone around them better people. David stood quietly absorbing this wisdom while the other students began to disperse as they left. Several of them bowed respectfully to Margaret, something that had never happened in all her years of cleaning the gym. Over the following weeks, David's behavior began to change. He started arriving early to help set up equipment and stayed late to help newer students with their techniques. He also made a point of greeting Margaret each evening and asking about her day. One evening, about a month after their encounter, David approached Margaret as she was finishing her work. Mrs. Chen, he said, would you be willing to teach me? Margaret looked up from wiping down the mirrors. Teach you what? She asked. Everything. David said, the things you learned from your father about discipline and respect, the way you move with such efficiency and purpose, how to be the kind of martial artist who makes other people better. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering his request. Training with me wouldn't be like training in class, she finally said. It would mean early mornings and focusing on basics and spending more time on character than on techniques. David nodded eagerly. That's exactly what I want, he said, and so began an unusual partnership. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 6 a.m., David would meet Margaret in the small park behind the academy. She taught him forms that emphasized flow and control rather than power. She showed him meditation techniques that her father had learned during his military service. Most importantly, she shared stories from her own life about perseverance, humility, and finding strength in service to others. As the months passed, David's classmates began to notice changes in him. He became more patient with struggling students and more encouraging to those who were discouraged. His technical skills improved as well, but in a way that felt more mature and purposeful. The academy's head instructor, Master Williams, eventually learned about Margaret's background and asked if she would be willing to teach a weekly class. Margaret declined, but suggested that David might be ready to assist with teaching beginners. He's learned some important lessons, she told Master Williams, and I think sharing them with others would complete his education. David began helping with the junior classes and found that teaching young students was more rewarding than he had ever imagined. He remembered Margaret's lessons about character and made sure that respect and kindness were as much a part of the curriculum as kicks and punches. Years later, when David earned his third-degree black belt, Margaret was there for the ceremony. In his speech, he thanked Master Williams and his fellow students, but he saved his deepest gratitude for the woman who had taught him that true strength comes from lifting others up. Learned more about martial arts from Margaret Chen in 6 months, he said. than I had learned in the previous 10 years. Not because she's the most skilled fighter I've ever met, thou,